Okay.
So we got her wonderful voice. Well, good evening, everybody. I'm really excited to have you all here for a board ed discussion. And tonight's discussion is around the role of the board versus the role of management. And I'm really excited that Willow Shire and Jill Wittels are here with us, and of course, Alan Ridgestone, to have the discussion. Before we get started, I want to give you some dates. And if I can not be too technically challenged, I will try to put them in the chat, but here are some dates you want to know about additional board ed sessions. October 4th, there is a panel discussion on evolving trends in the boardroom competencies. October 21st, we have legal 2.0. So if you did the legal last year, we are enhancing it to like the next level of discussion. November 4th, if you haven't signed up for our corporate salute, it's a signature event. Please sign up. Indra Nui is going to be our guest speaker. So you're not going to want to miss that. November 15th is a Finance 2.0 on the board. And then we're going to take a break. In January, you'll see this also within the Boston Club piece. January 11th, NACD New England has a program on proxy and ESG, and they are kind enough to allow us to co-host it. There will be a fee for it, but we will be able to come in at the NACD member fee. So if you're interested in that topic, Ellen Ridgestone is leading that. It is a really good high-powered panel discussion. So be on the lookout for that. We'll have February, I think it's going to be February 9th. We're going to do cybersecurity in the board. March, NACD has an aspiring boot camp. I think it's going to be the 24th or 25th of March. It's a one-day event. It'll be in person if we can do that. And we're co-hosting that again with NACD. And then June 16th, we'll have board and digital. So there's a lot of events that we have, and there's probably more that will come in. International Women's Day, we haven't landed on the topic for that. So be on the lookout in the dashboard for the board ed events. We're trying to give you a little taste almost every month as best we can, and then take a little break in the summer, and then take a little break in the winter. So with that, I'm really excited. I'm going to turn it over to you, Ellen, and I'll spotlight Ellen and Willow and Jill for tonight's discussion.
Great. All right, let me kick off with an introduction of two ladies, two women who frankly need no introduction, but I'll do it anyway. I've known both for many years. Willow Shire, who's joining us today, has been an independent director of the TJX companies since 1995, where she's a member of the Comp Committee and chairs NomGov, the NomGov committee. She also served as an independent director of VTES Semiconductors. Her background includes 20 years in the computer industry, employed by Digital Equipment Corporation and HP in various very senior executive roles. Dr. Jill Wittels is President and Chief Operating Officer of Nextion Technologies. She has a 30+ year history in aerospace and defense, as well as 2 decades of working with early stage companies and mentoring entrepreneurs. She is the board chair for Imagine Corporation, public company, and board chair for Hilltop Biosciences. Jill's actually the board chair on one of the companies where I chair the audit committee. So she could tell you the good and the bad and the ugly about me as an audit committee chair. But she's an amazing board chair, and Willow's an amazing director, and I feel lucky that I'm here with the two of them. So the focus of today's discussion is around, we've talked about what it's like to be on a public company board. And for many people, one of the hardest things of going from, call it management, to being on a board is that you're used to being part of management, but now you're a board member and it's not the same. Yet the board gets involved in many topics, which are the same, but they come at it from different angles. We're going to cover mainly 4 different areas today. And again, our focus is on public companies, public company boards. The four areas we're going to focus in on are strategy, succession planning, stakeholder relationships, and crisis management. So as we kick it off, Willow and Jill, can you help set the stage by speaking about the focus of the board versus the focus of management? Willow, do you want to go first?
Sure. This is a great topic because I think this is the single biggest mistake that brand new directors make. Brand new directors often are so eager to be helpful and prove their value that they overstep all the time, and they don't really need to. Very simply stated, the board is elected by and serves at the pleasure of the investors. And the investors, it's a big group. It's a wide ranging group. There are people who just care about ESG. There are people who just care about profit. And we work as directors, as elected public directors for all of them. So there's no one stance that you take at any time. You're thinking about the big picture, the long term, as well as the short term. The CEO, on the other hand, works directly for the board of directors. He or she directly manages the organization. We do not manage the organization. We provide oversight, we direct the compensation for, and we hire and fire the CEO. It's that simple, though it's very nuanced when you're sitting in the boardroom. And I think the single new skill that people who come out of management and go to sit on a board, the single new skill that's really important is how to ask smart, thoughtful questions. Rather than make statements, we don't assume that the CEO hasn't thought about this, doesn't know about this. We don't make those assumptions, but we do frequently ask, hopefully, thoughtful questions that require an in-depth response. And if he or she can't make it on the spot, it comes back through one or more people on his staff at another time. But that's the simple way of looking at it.
Okay, Jill?
I would supplement what Willow says from the perspective that I have seen board members make the mistake at both ends of the spectrum. So in my last corporate job, I had a C-suite job working for a very powerful and incredibly competent CEO. And he picked some reasonably high-powered people for his board, but he basically ran the company and they didn't work very hard and rubber stamped whatever he did. And that can work for a while too, but when he died suddenly, you had a board that didn't know which way was up. So that model doesn't work very well. And Willow has described particularly with newer, overeager board members, they are trying too hard. So, for me personally, when I became the chair of the board of Imagine, which God help me is 10 years ago now, I talked to the CEO directly about our relative roles, how often he wanted to talk to me, what kind of advice he would like or not like, so that we could draw some lines. Now, if you're just joining a board as a director, you don't necessarily get to have that conversation, but that temptation to step across that line is even greater if you're the chair of the board than it is if you just come in as a director. So I endorse everything that Willow said about that, but I also would like people to just keep in mind that just saying, oh, well, the CEO will do that and not paying attention is the mistake on the other side, and that you have to find an accommodation in the middle that allows everyone to do their part in the proper way. And that's not a single balance. That's a bit of a dynamic balance depending on what's going on. Because when the board comes around to saying we need a new CEO, that dynamic balance changes a lot. So you have to keep track of the fact that it's not like there's clearly defined lines and you just have to color within the lines. The lines are moving.
Yeah, And I think most of us who have done board work have been in the position of having to fire the CEO. It's not just hiring, it's firing them as well when they are not doing their job. And after some period of time, you determine that they're not going to be able to do their job. And in order to be able to hire or fire, you have to be really attuned to the business, really attuned to his or her staff, really understand the strategy, understand the whole business, or you can't really evaluate that CEO.
So have either of you found it necessary to, or hit one of those situations where you've actually had to explain to either management or to fellow board members that
Oh, of course.
what their role really is? And by the way, you shouldn't be doing X, you should be doing more of Y. Could you
Yes,
give
I
us a
have- I
couple
have a-
examples? Okay.
I have a great example of that. So
Okay.
relatively early on in my tenure as chair of the board, the board became increasingly unhappy with the CFO that was there. He was a very cagey guy. I mean, you'd have to ask him for information. And he was one of those people who would give you exactly what you asked for. So if you didn't ask for exactly the right thing, you didn't really get the picture you were looking for. And the board was getting increasingly frustrated. And the CEO wasn't thrilled with him either. But over the course of a year, I had a number of conversations with the CEO, who I was also doing some mentoring with, to say, we're not going to tell you to get rid of the CFO. You are going to have to tell us that you want to get rid of the CFO. And the minute you say that, we will help you find a much better CFO. But we are not going to do that until you say, I have to replace the CFO. And
Not your job.
And he took the better part of a year to do that, because he's the kind of guy who didn't like the idea of firing in that situation. But he did finally one day say, I think it's time to replace the CFO. And I jumped right on top of it and went, okay, good. Let's put a plan together. We'll have you a new, really good CFO in no time flat. But I drew the line very, very carefully about what you have to do and what the board has to do.
Yep.
And
That CFO worked for that person, the CEO.
that's right. So we could beat up on the CFO as much as we wanted about what we wanted from him and what we didn't like about the way he was behaving. But the CEO had to come to a decision to replace him.
My experience is we've often had the problem with first-time public board new directors. And there were almost two kinds. There was one, a person who joined the board who came out of the same industry. So they thought they really wanted to contribute, jump in and contribute right away. So they start convening people on the management staff to talk about logistics, because they feel they're the best person ever in the world to talk about logistics. That does not go over well. That is inappropriate. The second problems we have are people who come from a totally different industry and they want to apply their industry to this business. And so if it's security, digital security, every conversation is a digital security, has a digital security twist, and that didn't work either. So there's, particularly for the first year or so, it's primarily listening, asking questions, getting to know the business, the organization. And if you're going to make a comment or do something that you have any question about, go to Jill, go to the board chair, go to the nom-gov chair, talk with them one-on-one. They're your colleagues. They don't want you to fail. They want the board as a whole to be successful. And you go talk with one of your colleagues on the board first before you say anything in a meeting. My advice.
What about situations where management actually doesn't want the board involved because they're holding it close to their vest, and it's something that the board should be involved with? How do you walk that line?
I think Jill goes and talks to that CEO and said, understand that this might make you a little uncomfortable, but we feel strongly about it. This is something we really should be doing. And then you do it.
So one of the ways you do that also is that most board chairs, most CEOs, even the controlling ones, kind of at least have to discuss board meeting agendas with either their lead director or their board chair. And I use that opportunity to say, we want a presentation on this subject at the next board meeting. You can have whoever you want do that, and we'll, allocate some time, but the board needs to learn more about this subject and what the company is doing. And that is almost an impossible request to refuse by the CEO of a company. So again, by asking for information, as Willow suggested, that's how you elicit. Well, you also elicit the focus of the company, because they have to put that pitch together, which means somebody has to think about what they're going to say.
So here's Renee has asked a question about onboarding, and I think it actually connects nicely with this. So you're a first time public company board member. You want to get the best onboarding possible so that you can hit the road running as quickly as possible. What are the best examples of onboarding have you seen done?
Actually, Ellen, you do the best job of anybody. So the most recent board member on the Imagine board, which is the board that Ellen serves on with me, we handed his onboarding to Ellen, and she did an absolutely bang up job. I feel like you ought to answer this question. But I think there are a number of things, and Ellen, I'm going to ask you to add to this when I'm done. I mean, for one thing, you want to make sure that that person gets a lot of information to read. And then, Willow, as you said, if they have a lot of questions about that, the first thing they should do is ask other board members, can you explain this to me? Do you understand why the company is doing that? And they can come up to speed that way. And then they need to continue their board education. So you need to figure out what are the education pieces that are the highest priority for this new board member to learn about. And the company doesn't have to pay for all of the board education, but they should pay for some of it every year, which is why you need to think about what's the thing that this company should pay for this board member to learn about. And that's how they begin to climb up the learning curve between the education and the knowledge of the company and the conversations with the other board members.
I think that onboarding needs to be written down on paper. And I think it's a 12-month plan of onboarding. It's not a one conversation. It's not the first month on the job. It's a year. And by putting it down as a year, and that's the financial calendar. There's a lot of things that happen over the year. So it also reminds the new director that they're in training or they're learning for a year. It takes a year to learn a board and a business well enough to provide oversight to that business. And I think a lot of people participate in that. In this written document, you have them meeting one-on-one with the CFO, one-on-one with head of merchandising. You have visits to the facilities. There's a lot of pieces that go into this so that the new director really understands the business and doesn't think they got it in the first month.
Yeah, I agree with that completely. And part of that, which is why I was discussing the go to the other board members, you also want, aside from sort of artificially setting up one-on-one calls with each of the board members, it's better if they have a subject, a topic, a particular thing, and then you say, well, go talk to this board member. And then they also get to know that board member, because boards need to operate as a body themselves. So it's not just about learning the company and learning and meeting the executives, which is important. It's also about meeting every other member of the board and talking to those other board members and understanding the culture of the way the board behaves.
I would ditto all of that from my experience. I think there's one, it's a small nuance, but it's one that's one of my favorites that I'm not sure Willow or Jill will agree with me, but I'll try it out here. I happen to think that for a first-time board member, first-time public company board member, I think it is great to have them go on the audit committee. And whether or not they're a financial expert. And the reason is.
He likes to
you
torture
re-
them.
Yeah, there you go. I like to torture people. But seriously, you
I-
learn so much about the company and how, I call it, how the sausage gets made and how business decisions turn out and how they're described in our SEC filings and what the biggest red flags are. And it just, it can be painful if you're not a financial person, but you know what?
You got to
It's
know
your
it.
responsibility. Exactly.
I'm a NomGov fan, a devotee of NomGov, and I agree with you, Ellen.
Oh,
I
that's
don't think your first board committee should ever be NomGov. I think it absolutely should be audit. I agree with you.
Great. So there's one question sitting on here which says, what about when the CEO is also the chair? Let me just say simply, for any public company board, if the CEO is the chair, then you have a lead
a lead
independent director. So substitute my words every time we say chair, lead independent director, because they're
Right.
the ones that it's either the chairman of the board if you've got a split between CEO and chair, or the lead independent director if you don't have a separate chair.
And
So
a lead independent director is equally powerful and effective as the chair, I believe.
Well,
Good one.
I also think it's actually not the best practice to have the
No.
CEO be the chair. And it is much less common now than it was, say, 10 years ago, where pretty much every large company, that was the structure. And it's the structure for fewer of them than before.
But Jill, we're also finding, like you see at TJX, that a retired executive from the organization may become the chair. So they're equally insiders.
Right.
So a lead director is a strong, confident lead director is critical in all those. So it's whether it's the chair or the lead director, they've got to do their job well.
Well,
Yeah.
I think that's the point. Whether it's the person has the title of board chair and they're independent, or if they're the lead independent director, they've got to be strong and handle it. Now, here's an interesting thing. What happens if there's a problem with the board chair? What does another director do in that case?
Well, when the board chair is an insider, there has to be executive sessions at every board meeting, usually at the beginning and always at the end. And that's where you raise these issues, because
Well, let's assume that the lead independent director or board chair is independent. So now they are the problem. What do the other directors do?
The way that I became the chair of the board of Imagine was when the rest of the board got together, told the existing chair that the next board person they brought in was going to take over as chair of the board. And basically they retired him. And retiring a member of the board, it's harder if it's the chair, but you have to do it anyway. There are times when you simply have to go to a board member, and by you go to, what I mean is the rest of the board, and this does not get done in the meetings. It gets done by outside conversation, building up a consensus kind of one at a time to say, you know what, this person needs to retire, either because they really need to retire, like they're falling asleep during board meetings, or they're not coming to board meetings. Those are two of the common issues. Or we need to bring somebody else in from the outside in order to change the perspective on the board. And the only way to do that is to ask somebody to retire from the board. And it's never particularly fun to do that. I have to say, every time I've done it, the response has been some level of unhappiness, but a complete level of professionalism in response to that. And But it's like being the CEO and getting rid of somebody. I mean, somebody has to step up and do that job when it's important to get done, whether it's whatever. I mean, getting rid of somebody at a senior level is always hard. But the other people that are responsible for this have to step up and exercise their responsibility and figure out who's going to deliver the message, or maybe they're going to deliver it collectively at a non-executive session at the end of the meeting, where they sit down and say to the board chair, the rest of us really feel it's time for you to retire. That's very difficult for somebody to fight.
And the board it's a very democratic organization, actually, because it's one person, one vote. And you always try to work toward consensus, always. And therefore, a lot of discussions happen outside the meeting, among and between directors. And when you have, if you have really close consensus that this person has to retire, taking that message is not anything that they can argue with. I mean, they can be upset by it. But as you said, I've always seen them be very professional. I've seen it happen, but they're also professionals.
So if we shift the conversation slightly and go to our first major subject area, which is strategy. Let's talk for a second about who has what role in the development of strategy for a company. And let's talk about some different examples. So there may be a paradigm shift in an industry. You may be adding a new product line. You may be doing M&A. There are a lot of different things that go into strategy. So Willow, can I go to you first? The role of board versus management on strategy.
Well, the role of the board is to understand and confirm, approve the strategy. But that said, it takes a lot more discussion than just an I vote. It is that's where a lot of questioning comes in, a lot of suggestions, questioning. But in the end, it's the CEO and the organization's strategy that the board will ultimately approve. So, and you take as long as it takes to get your questions answered, you may suggest that they think about this, that, or the other, but it's always at the end, that strategy belongs to the CEO and the organization with the board's fingerprints all over it. But that's the way it is.
So Jill, what if the company's talking about a strategic partnership with another company? Does that change this dynamic?
Well, I would say I have a slightly different view of the dynamic than Willow does. I think strategy is one of the only, if not the only area where when there needs to be a kind of working group on a particular strategic path, a possible strategic path, where you actually might have a board member or two who are assigned to work with management on determining whether that strategic path is appropriate. Now, the management still has to, if you will, make the decision about what they want to do and bring it to the board for approval. But it's one, if not the only area in which board members are sometimes appropriately actively involved in the fact-finding part of figuring this out. And if it's about a strategic alliance, that's a particular example of that, because some of the board members may have entrees into the senior executive level of the target or potential company that the executive management of the company by themselves does not have. And you should be leveraging your board members' ability to provide that contact or that entree, or to have a private conversation with the person that they know and then get the company access at the right level. So I think that's just a great example of where you're going to leverage the board members as part of strategy in a way that you would never leverage them in for the operations of the company.
I agree with you, Jill. And when you say I think you're saying that the CEO should be leveraging his or her board members
Yes.
and their access points, their knowledge, their industry contacts. So this, it's still the CEO's strategy, but you're right. They would be foolish to take 9 very influential people and ignore their advice or their contacts. That would be foolish.
Right, and sometimes the CEO will hire a consultant, and that helps too. And then the consultant and the board members together are providing that sort of consulting advice to the CEO, except that eventually the board members will have to bless whatever strategy the CEO decides he thinks is appropriate, he or she thinks is appropriate for the company. So I do think that strategy is an area that is different from all of the operational areas of the company. And that is why it's important to have a board meeting every year that is just focused on strategy. You kind of put aside the operational issues and you really focus on what are the company's strategic options? Is there something new that needs to be looked at? Is there something old that needs to be shut off? And you have a lot of discussion about, very active discussion about that, but you're still going to turn to the CEO and go, now what do you want to do?
So do your comments, both of you, your comments change if, let's say you've just hired a new CEO. So now you're dealing with and let's assume for an example, not only is he or she a new CEO, but it's their first time being a CEO of a public company. Does that change how
Not
you'd approach this
really.
or not?
The thing that's a little different is that there's probably more mentoring of the CEO involved, but mentoring is not making decisions for them. Mentoring is helping them figure out how to grow into that job. You may also want to think about getting them a job coach from the outside, or making them read Hillary's book about what the transition, what the proper transition plan is into a new level of responsibility. I mean, you want to give them every possible kind of help that you can give them, and that does not include doing their job for them.
So there's an interesting question here on chat from Maggie. How many companies actually have an annual strategy meeting with the board? And I think, I think the one thing I'll just say is, and let me see if Willow and Jill agree with me, is that it used to be, you used to do an annual strategy meeting and never talked about strategy again, which in the last 15 years has gone the way of, I think the expression is the way of the dodo bird. So strategy is always there. It's always part of the discussion. But I think the question is how many companies, in addition to that, still, have annual strategy sessions where, whether it's 100% or 89, the majority of the meeting is talking about key strategic issues. Willow?
I don't know how many do it. All the ones I've been in or know of do it, but I don't know the numbers on that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would echo that. I don't know the numbers on that either. I think it's more companies than used to. And I think the more that there are board members that are asking when are we going to do our annual strategy meeting discussion, the more influential you can be as a director in getting that company to do the right thing. I frankly think that I lost out on getting a board seat once when during the interview process, I asked rather directly about annual strategy meeting, and I was looked at, well, this was, of course, it was an all-male board as well, so I was talking to a series of men, and they looked at me like I had two heads, and I think they thought, oh, she's going to be difficult. So
Well, you dodged a bullet, Jill.
Exactly.
probably a good outcome for everybody in the end, because if that was something that they thought was off the table, that was probably not a board that I wanted to be on. But it was a very interesting litmus test. It was not what I would have forecast as the litmus test for that particular board.
So here's an interesting question, and my experience is I have yet to run into a board that doesn't have at least an annual session on strategy and then continues to have conversations during the year. Having said that, that may be different if a company is just going public, you know, because my private companies have always been a bit different. So there's an interesting question from Karen, which says, can you discuss the dynamics of the board convening an independent, specialized, ad hoc, limited duration advisory entity to help them with an issue they'd like to investigate? So it might be a cyber issue, it might be a an SEC issue, a filing issue, any of those. Willow, I know you've been through this.
TJX did exactly that. After the intrusion, which was the first big retail corporate intrusion. In fact, Fortune magazine wrote the New York Times wrote a big piece on it called The Great Cyber Heist, which if you like spy novels, go online and look for The Great Cyber Heist. It's fascinating. It's international intrigue. It's everything you could want in a spy novel. And it ended well. That's the other thing. But we put a special committee on cybersecurity together from the board, hired a person onto the board with that expertise, and he had a subcommittee of audit. So he reported to the audit chair on this, but had complete access to the whole IT organization and really was a consultant of sorts, very much a consultant, and helped hire the top IT people, was a very active subcommittee for a specific duration and served the role extraordinarily well.
Yeah, I've worked with companies that did the same thing for actually sort of back in the day when semiconductor company, when everybody was ratcheting up the environmental controls and the waste disposal issues. And so, you know, we needed to do a series of upgrades associated with detaching an enormous number of drains from the plumbing system and having, you know, waste picked up and properly disposed of. And we did the same approach. And I think when you have a very, I mean, that was a retail company, but that was a specialized tech issue, if you will. When you have particularly specialized tech issues that are not necessarily the direct business of the company, that is by far your best approach for a variety of reasons, everything from getting the right answer to the problem to protecting the company management and the board by making it very clear that they're doing everything in their power to try to get the right answer. They don't have an a priori answer. They want to find the right thing to do. And the legal protection is an important piece in addition to the finding the right thing to do piece.
Good points, Jill.
So-
You're right.
So switching topics to our second major topic, which is succession planning. Jill, I'm going to go to you first on this. So let's talk about it in terms of several categories. One, which is who drives it. Now, we know the board's responsibility, one of the main responsibilities is to hire and fire the CEO. So there's succession planning for the CEO. There's also executive management and what role does the board get involved with in that. And then before we leave this, I'm going to turn to the board succession planning, but we'll save the board succession planning to the end. Let's start with management. Let's start with first the CEO and then executive management. Willow, do you want to go first on that one?
I think the board has an obligation to do succession planning, certainly for the CEO. And something may happen. Who knows what can happen at any moment, anytime. So you need to have a plan where you know who's going to step in tomorrow, even if it's a temporary thing. We had that happen at TJX. We had a CEO leave but we had a plan. We had our board director was experienced and stepped into that role for almost a year as we found the replacement. So you've got to have a plan of succession for the CEO. And then you've got to also require that the CEO do the same for his or her direct staff and on down. Increasingly, as we look at diversity in the organization, it's not good enough to do 1 or 2 levels of succession planning. It's got to go much deeper in the organization to achieve the diversity that we really need to run a long-term healthy business. So the board has to take responsibility for making sure that, for doing it for the CEO and making sure that it happens, doing very in detail reviews of that succession planning of the key executives in the organization.
Jill, thoughts?
I have a bunch of thoughts on this subject. So I mentioned about working at the C-suite in a company where the CEO and board chair of that company really had the board in the palm of his hand, and then he dropped dead on relatively sudden notice. And to the best of my ability to tell, there was no succession plan. And yet, and there were several people at the next level who, sharpened their claws and reached out for the CEO's job. It was a mess. I won't even go into all the details. It was a mess. And it had a lot of influence on the trajectory of the company after that, which is a highly successful company, but it completely changed the character of the company that it had under the previous CEO, because nobody had put a plan together, and it just kind of fell into place. The other thing I would say is I've also seen many instances where there were succession plans, and what happened when somebody needed to be replaced had no resemblance whatsoever to what was in the succession plans. So I think it's also really important to think about, are we checking the box because this is a job? I mean, this is a task that is assigned either to the executives and or to the board, and look, check, we have a succession plan. Or are we really, is that what we would really do if that happened? And it matters. It matters to how you think through the succession plan. It matters to the careers of the people that are in the succession plan, who think that they actually have an opportunity, occasionally only to find out, well, that was only on paper. They don't really have an opportunity to move into another job. So I think there's a fair number of landmines around the succession planning process. I completely agree with everything that Willow said, but I think it's important also to be knowledgeable about the landmines, because you have to watch for them as this process is going on in order to avoid stepping on one. If you're not conscious of the landmines, it really raises the risk for how the process will actually work if somebody quits and or dies and or is hospitalized, and maybe in the COVID era, that's even been a bigger risk. So I think that's a piece of it too, is to think about what is the context for this? Do we really mean what we're saying, in addition to have we filled out the piece of paper?
So if we take a second and think about the board, well, I'm going to come back to you in a second, but let me go to Jill first on building a skills matrix. Jill, can you describe the process and sort of how people should understand? Because when folks are talking to companies, the board is clearly sitting looking at a matrix and trying to define what they need. Could you take us through that? And then I'm going to have Willow kind of come back as the chair of NomGov and kind of give us the whole picture, if you will.
Okay, so a board skill matrix is a very important thing to have, and it has many different sections in it. But basically, it's a matrix that lists the people who are currently on the board, and then a whole set of competencies for the board of that company. Some of them are generic competencies and some of them are very company specific or market specific or competitive environment specific for that company. And what you want to do every year is kind of go through and check off, and you really would like multiple people on the board to check every single box on that board matrix. It's not like, you know, you want to have so many things that there's only one person here. If you only have one person, that's not a conversation. That's just one person. So that process is typically best done by having a combination, if you've never, especially if you've never done it before, by having a combination of the senior management and the board members go through and create the matrix. What does each one think the competencies are? And you have to kind of collect up that data and put it together and get a consensus around that. And then annually update the way the current board fills that in order to decide, well, first of all, is there something new? If the company is going to do a strategic pivot, that board matrix may need to change significantly because, for example, if you're pivoting into a new product line or a new market, then you might need board competencies in some of those areas that you didn't have before. And then another thing that happens is looking at, I mean, you don't specifically put age usually in a board matrix, but you do worry about the age mix on your board. And if you're going to do a huge campaign that's targeted at Gen Z and your board is all over 55, you might want to scratch your head and go, do we even know what we're talking about? Or do we need some blood on this board that's, you know, they don't have to be 25 years old, but, you know, you might want them a little bit younger and a little bit more versatile in what young people are focused on and how they operate and what's important to them and their values. So those things have to sort of come into the conversation about the makeup of the board, but you start with the skill sets. And one of those skill sets could in fact be an indicator for age mix.
So we're under the auspices of the conversation is succession planning. So Willow, coming back to you as chair of NomGov, how do you view succession planning of the entire board?
Well, I
How do
think
you go
Jill's
through
right
the
on.
process?
You look at the strategy of the company, where we're going 5+ years out. You look at the skills that you currently have on the board, and then you start identifying both the soft and hard skills that you're looking for in a director. Chemistry is important. There's no question about it. Chemistry is important. And so there are soft skills, there's some style things, but there's also a lot of hard skills when you look at what exists and what you need. And I have never thought diversity is a skill, but diversity is critical on a board. I was just really proud to have TJX have a North African Muslim, a Puerto Rican Black person. We had 6 women. We had somebody from Hong Kong, a Chinese guy from Hong Kong. We had a Hispanic guy from Cuba. We had a very diverse board, and we never went looking for the guy from Hong Kong. But what we did do, we practiced the Rooney Rule, and I would tell everybody that I'm not going to begin interviewing at all until we have a diverse slate of people who actually meet the requirements. And once we had a diverse slate of people who met the requirements and we interviewed, you picked the best person. And oh, by the way, that best person was as likely to be a person of color as it was a white person. So we ended up with an extremely diverse board without ever looking expressly for diversity. And it's not rocket science. It's not even that difficult to do. There are great people out there who are good board candidates. There's a lot of them. You just need to, who was it that said, it's amazing what you see when you look?
The one thing I would say to that, Willow, is that I think in the sort of TJX retail business, it's unforgivable not to have a highly diverse board. I've mostly been involved with very tech companies, and sometimes it is really work to go find a diverse slate of candidates. By the way, you can almost always find one if you do that work, but sometimes we've hired headhunters, you'll pardon the term, search firms, and then have to beat them over the head with a 2x4 when they came back with only white male candidates because they just really hadn't done the work.
Jill, you are so right. We hired one of the very biggest search firms back in the day who gave us an all white male slate. And I said, well, that's not what we're looking for. And they said, you don't understand, it's really hard. And I said, well, that's okay, not a problem. I can find another search firm. And then they said, oh, wait, let us call our London office and see who they might have. I said, oh, what a good idea. And we got Zain Abdullah from that search. And he ran all of Mars for Europe and Russia. Fabulous director, fabulous director. When they couldn't find one.
My funniest moment was actually a mentoring moment with a startup company that was 2 or 3 guys. This is a very, very early stage mentoring that I do. And they were trying to develop a medical product for women.
No women on the board.
There were no women on the team. There were no women on the board. There was
all
no
the time.
anywhere. And
Yeah.
It's really disappointing, isn't
you
it?
guys are
There's-
so far off base.
So I need to keep us moving here. There's one question which from chat, which is, how concerned should one be for directors with long tenure, e.g. over 10 years? Are they no longer independent? Willow, I'll let you give a quick answer. You and I've had this conversation.
Yeah.
And then I'm going to move on to another topic.
I would propose they are even more independent than most of the other directors. I was at TJX for 27 years, and I could say things to the CEO that nobody else could say because they trusted me. They'd seen me for years. I saw 4 CEOs come and go. I saw 5 board chairs come and go. And so I had this long-term, I did not have alliance to any one of those CEOs. I had an alliance to the company overall and the shareholders, and they knew that. So I think long-term directors can be even more independent than the brand new director who's trying to make a good impression, who's trying to, be helpful. I didn't have to do any of that.
So let's move to the area of
I
stakeholder
knew where all the
relationships.
skeletons were buried too.
Yeah, exactly.
That's the most valuable part.
Exactly. So let's talk about stakeholder relationships. So we're going to actually talk about, the stakeholders or shareholders, employees, supply chain management, suppliers, etc. And the question, of course, where the conversation is, who's taking the lead, the board director or management? And if the person or the group isn't taking the lead, what's their role? So let me start with shareholders, and Jill, let me go to you first. So can you divide for us between normal shareholder activity and an active situation? Go to Jill, and then Willow, I want to make sure you get time on this one. Oop, did you?
So I think the board has to make itself available to talk to shareholders that want to talk to board members. And with a public company, of course, that's also what the annual meeting is about. It's the opportunity for the shareholders to, back when we did them in person, to actually come in and meet and talk to board members. Other than that, I would say it is really primarily the CEOs and the executives' responsibility to communicate information about the business, strategy, results. All of that is really management's responsibility to communicate to the shareholders. And when a shareholder approaches a board director to talk, you have to be extremely careful in what you say, because first of all, there's material non-public information, which you cannot provide. And you certainly do not want in any sense to be criticizing the management team with an individual shareholder. You don't necessarily want to be defending them either, but you just have to be exceptionally careful in what you say. I'm going to veer from your topic very slightly here, Ellen, because I think the one place that there is an important role for the board is in the employee stakeholders, in making sure that the employees are being listened to by the management and facilitating that. I mean, I was always very pleased by any member of a company that felt safe enough to get in touch with me. This wasn't some line where they don't give their name or whatever, but literally to pick up the phone or send an email to me to say, hey, I work in the fab, but I'm really concerned about X, Y, Z, and I want to make sure the board knows about it. Now, I think you have to be very careful what you do with that, but I think it's also very important that employees of the company whose board you're on feel like they can do that.
And I agree with you, Jill. I think that the 2 points are everybody on the board, every director should have legal training in how to respond and what the law is and what your legal responsibility is. But the second thing is most people, whether it's shareholders or employees, want you to listen to them. You don't have to answer. You don't say, I can fix that. You don't say, I'll do X, Y, Z. They want to be listened to. Even shareholders, they want to be listened to, that you hear their opinion and their point of view. And so my job as a director, whether it was with associates on the payroll or ESG activists, is they want to be listened to and they want to know they've been heard and they want to know that you will consider it. And that's all I can ever say is I really appreciate your coming to me, letting me know this. I will share it appropriately and I can't promise anything.
So is it safe to say, though, that the lead from the company's viewpoint on discussions with shareholders really starts with the CEO and his team?
Always.
And the board really gets pulled in only at the request either of the management team or when a shareholder reaches out to management and says, we'd like to speak to X.
With one big exception. Which is executive compensation. That is the purview of the board. That is nothing that management gets to say yay or nay over. And the chair of executive comp has to be ready to listen to shareholders, whether management wants them to or not.
Besides which, what I would say is, although it's a nice thing to say that, the shareholder should ask management, they don't have to do that. They have no requirement to do that. So you as a board member, as Willow said, you have to know what is appropriate for your response to a shareholder that does reach out to you, because
It'll happen.
they don't really care if they have to talk to the CEO or not. I mean, a lot of them will, but many of them won't.
It will happen.
Right.
So here's an interesting question from Scotty that got asked actually early on in our conversation, but I think now is a good time to bring it up. Is Scotty asked, how open do you find management on problems that have not yet arisen in the financials or operations of the company, but that can be anticipated for the company in the future?
It depends on the relationship the board has with that CEO. If they have had a collegial relationship, if they are trying to be supportive while being honest, and a good CEO will hopefully want you to be honest and helpful. If they don't want any of that, you may not have the right CEO. I don't know, Jill. What do you think?
I agree with what Willow says.
There you go. All right, so now let's talk about, you're sitting on the board. one of the stakeholder relationships that's very important is for the board to understand sort of employees below the CEO. So what are the best ways for board members to be able to get to know employees at the company without running into problems with being viewed as directing employees when their job is not operational?
So I think
Yep.
there's a few answers to that question. And a lot depends on the size of the company. Certainly, if the company has a bunch of locations, you'd like the board meetings to be at some of those other locations, be able to take tours of those facilities, to, you know, meet and shake the hand when you could still shake hands, bump elbows with employees at different locations, so they get to see that you're a human being and that you have questions, that you're interested in their job and how they like their job. And because, you know, when you're talking to somebody that you meet on the floor, you can ask them questions. How do you like your job? How do you like what the company does? How long have you worked for the company? I mean, you can get them talking about their job, and that's a really good way to do it. Many companies don't have multiple locations, and some companies are smaller. So the last two Imagine board meetings, I actually went to the facility for the board meeting. Most of the board didn't, but all the executives were vaccinated. I was vaccinated. I said, you know what, I'm going to drive down there and I'm going to do the board meeting from the facility. And as part of that, I offered to the executives, you know, I'd be happy to have a meeting with a small group of employees, no executives present, if you're comfortable having me do that. And they picked a group of employees from many different departments. And I had a listening session with a group of employees. And the second time Ellen came down, and we each had a listening section with a group of employees. And that's not a huge company. I mean, that company has, I don't know, something over 100 employees. So in a very short time, we had met with probably 30% of the employees in the company. And I think that was a very effective method for getting feedback. But, you know, in a big company, if you meet with 10 people, you're barely scratching the surface. So you have to kind of develop a game plan that gets you that. Of course, you want people to come into the board meeting and present to the board, but that's very stiff and formal. That's good. You get an idea of the competence of the leadership, but you don't really get feedback on the culture that way. To get the feedback on the culture, you have to have a way to kind of find people in their milieu and ask them how they're doing that day and what's going on in their life, kind of questions. That's what
I think, Jill, you said something really important before, which was ask management to get XYZ person to do a presentation for you.
Yeah.
That is, I mean, that's very insightful. You also can ask HR for a review of their hotline calls, because most companies have a complaint line or a way of an associate giving a feedback to management. Ask for a review of all of that. You also, one of the things I do, and I do it all the time, wherever I go to the bank, I go to Stop and Shop, wherever I go, I'll say to the person across the counter from me, what's it like to work here? And I do it in every TJX store. And I hit a lot of TJX stores. And I do it in every TJX store in my patched jeans. And I mean, I'm dressed up today. I'm usually not like this at all. And I'll go in and say, what's it like to work here? They think I'm inquiring about a job. I think that's what they think. And they'll tell me, oh my God, I love this place. My manager's teaching me something new every day. And my associates give me a ride home. I don't have a car. And the bus is, I get wet walking to the bus. So I've got an associate who gives me a ride home when it's raining. I mean, they'll tell you, this is the most boring job I've ever had in my life. I hate Stop and Shop or the bank or wherever. So if there's any access you have, all you need to ask is, what's it like to work here?
So there are a couple of interesting questions on the chat board. The first one is from Renee, which is, how does the board interact with the internal legal team, assuming there's an internal legal team? I know some of my companies have both a general counsel inside and then there's outside counsel in addition. Some companies, it's only outside counsel. So how does the board interact with legal, internal and external? And does the board have separate sessions with legal? Jill, do you want to take it from the big company standpoint? And then Jill, could you take it from the smaller company just to kind of give a compare and contrast?
Yeah, so
Maybe the same answer.
what I would say is, well, it is pretty much the same answer. I mean, legal is like every other department. If the company has legal risk issues, and of course, a lot of what the board should be looking at is risk mitigation. What are the company's risks and what is the company doing to mitigate those risks? And legal risks are always on the list of, what legal risks do we have? Are there lawsuits that we have? Are there former employee lawsuits? Are there customer lawsuits? I mean, what do we need to be worried about? And legal should be involved in those conversations, just like the operations team is involved in the operations conversations. But I don't know that in general, either for a big company or a small company, there is a reason for the board to routinely just meet with the legal department. That would be my view.
Yeah. The board, I've never had the board as a whole have executive sessions with just legal.
Right.
On the other hand, the chief, the corporate secretary or the chief legal counsel was my closest relationship for NomGov in the C-suite. They were very important to me, as well as the TJX used ropes and gray. They were important to me also. I spent a lot of time with legal.
So
And
not in my public board role, but I was 15 years on the supervisory board for Fermi National Accelerator Lab, which was run by the government, but run by an outside company for the government. And every board meeting that we had included a review by legal, because I mean, there were always legal issues there that needed to be reviewed. My public companies typically, there are fewer, but there are some.
Oh, there are.
So I the only thing I would add is at my larger public companies, we always have at audit an executive session with the outside counsel. And usually it's in context of something that's happened in the whistleblower line, but it could just be some issue that's come up that the audit committee just needs to hear on a little more on. So it is very normal to have an executive session at the audit committee with the outside general counsel or inside, depends on what the topic is. So with that, Hillary, how long do you want us to keep going here? We have more. I do want to do a wrap-up question. Is this about time?
Yeah, this is about a good time to make sure that we have covered the questions in chat. If
Okay.
live questions, we could maybe entertain that.
Well, I'd say so. The wrap-up question, which I think is important, is and we didn't get to the crisis management discussion, but the topic here was the difference between the roles of the board versus management, and what are the 2 or 3 takeaways that you'd like everybody on this call to remember about the differences in the roles, given that people who are on this call are looking to be on public company boards. And Willow, do you want to go first?
Well, it's kind of where I began, that the directors report to, are elected by, serve at the pleasure of the investors. I don't take any single investor with more seriously than another. They all have different opinions, and if I distill them all down, It's the long-term health and welfare of the organization that I'm taking responsibility for. And the whole organization works for the CEO. And so my direct responsibility is oversight of that CEO, knowing the organization's business well enough that I can evaluate him or her to know whether they're doing their job properly and effectively or not. And the other is take a year to understand the landscape, learn the business, and develop a relationship with your colleagues on the board first. I mean, it's a democratic organization. You always want to achieve consensus. It may take you hours of conversation to achieve that consensus, but that's the goal. May not always reach it, but that's the goal. And so develop a relationship with your colleagues on the board and just make sure you're asking thoughtful, helpful questions. Those are my three.
Jill?
Okay, so I would say that the first one is basically to remember that the CEO and the executives run the company, and your job is to help them make the company as successful as possible. And generally, the presumption of that is also to make them as successful as possible, unless and until the board reaches an agreement that can't make the company successful with that particular
right.
executive, in which case the company's success is more important than the individual success. But generally, the success aligns. So while you're asking questions and providing oversight, you're doing it in a way that is supportive and designed to help the management team succeed. And so there is a heavy mentorship component of what the board does all the time. You're asking questions to make sure they haven't missed something. You're asking questions to make sure they go and get enough information about something that they might have missed, because everybody's got a set of blinders on. So part of the board's job is to make sure to pull open the management's blinders, because the management is, up to here in issues every day, to keep pulling their blinders open and making sure that they are taking in the right kind of information to make the right decisions. So I don't know how many that is. I didn't count 1, 2, or 3, but in the end, that would be my description of what's the most important thing that the board does.
Okay. Hillary, are we saying goodbye to people, or we could stay on for another 10 minutes and open it up to, if we change the view, bring everybody on and see if there are any last questions.
So let's, if there are any last questions, first of all, thank you for everybody that wrote things in chat. But if anyone has any last minute burning questions, love to hear you. It was a really good, very informative presentation tonight. Thank you so much, Willow and Jill.
So I promise I'll only ask one more question. It's Renee.
Go ahead. Yeah, hi Renee, go ahead.
If all three of you have had very esteemed careers on boards, and you're all very successful, and I've heard that from many people, including at the WCD events, seeing how many people admire you. If you wind the clock back and you say, I wish I would have known X sooner, what would that be? Or I wish I would have done X differently.
I would have looked for my first board seat sooner. Because I've really enjoyed being on boards, and for some fraction of boards, I'm sort of aging out. This is a little bit annoying because I feel like I want to do some more of this. So, I mean, just to be very frank, I would have started at a younger age, which I think a lot of people in this audience are doing. And I commend that.
Hello?
Gosh, I'm trying to think. I guess I wish there'd been something like this, because I had no clue what I was doing. And back in, 28, 30 years ago, I mean, they didn't even, onboarding wasn't a phrase they even used. So I would get, I think I wish I could have gotten more advice, more thoughts, more forums like this, and an opportunity to talk to some long-term directors. And I never did that, or I never had that opportunity. That's probably an excuse. But nonetheless, I didn't do it. I would have done a lot more of that.
Renee, great question. Thank you. Any other questions?
Ellen, you can answer that question too.
I know, I agree with what you guys said. I mean, I passed on a board because early on, I started sitting on public boards in 2003, but I had the opportunity, or at least to go through the process with a wonderful company, and my CEO did not want me to take time out of my day, even if it was going to be vacation days, and I kind of went along with that. So I should have started sooner. But you have to weigh choices, and you have to think about things. So and no path is right for the same two people. And I agree with Willow's comments. I think I had the luxury of having sat in a lot of boardrooms because I was CFO of some rather large companies. And
I never did.
and I did, so at least I saw it from afar. But it was such a difference than suddenly going on. I mean, my first public board was a Fortune 500 company, American Power Conversion, and all of a sudden I was chair of the audit committee, and
Oh
it
my
was my
God.
first time on a public board, right? I sort of walked in, had one meeting, and then there I am in the second meeting taking over. It's different. It's so remarkably different. And you can't even, I couldn't even, and I had had so much time in boardrooms, I was shocked at how different it was. So, I think what Willow's suggesting about programs like this, listening to other people, what they've gone through on their journeys. I spent like many of us, we spent most of our career, us and the boys. So it was incredible coming up with another woman on a board. It just really was remarkable. So anyway, I think I basically agree with Willow and Jill. Any other
So-
questions?
Yeah, so we'll take one more question if we have it. Otherwise, I want to thank all of you for attending. Thank you, and a big round of applause to Jill and Willow and Ellen. What a very interesting topic. I did, be on the lookout. We're trying to bring more events to you so that you can keep thinking about and preparing to be on your next board. So on behalf of the Boston Club and Ellen, Jill, and Willow, we thank you for being here tonight, and we'll see you at the next board event.
It was an honor
Thank
to
you,
be here.
guys. Thank you. Thank you, Jill and Willow.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Yeah.
Thank you.